Hey everyone, thanks for coming back. It's the end of the second quarter of 2024, which is a natural time to revisit what is known today about preparations for the upcoming Artemis missions, Artemis II, Artemis III, and Artemis IV. Artemis II is the closest to flight, with launch targeted for about 15 months from now, and there's more information about its current status and more frequent updates about it. But Artemis III and Artemis IV are significant flights, and we've talked about those a lot in the last quarter, with a lot of work being done in the programs across NASA's Moon to Mars program office. So there's a lot of interest in progress towards flying those. But updates for that work are less frequent, so there's less information to work with since the first quarterly update that I put out in late March. But let's take a look at the details and the big picture for those missions. Midway through 2024, the Artemis II flight and ground hardware are progressing towards integrated operations, where SLS and then Orion would be fully assembled for flight. We have some idea about when that will happen, but not enough yet to narrow things down to this month or that month. Integrated testing of ground systems at Pad 39B with Mobile Launcher 1 is now expected to continue until mid-summer. During the quarter, integrated systems verification and validation testing of the environmental control system and cryogenic propellant loading and management systems were reported by Exploration Ground Systems. Crawler Transporter 2 is completing a maintenance cycle in Vehicle Assembly Building High Bay 1 in preparation to support rolling ML1 back to VAB High Bay 3 when the testing at Pad 39B is complete. The launch team and support teams are continuing to conduct simulations of critical timelines in the launch countdown in preparation for their first crewed launch with Artemis II next year. Propellant loading or tanking and the terminal countdown timeline in the period surrounding the last 10 minutes of the count are often simulated in separate training sessions. Eventually, those simulations will include mission control at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, the SLS Support Center at Marshall Space Flight Center, and also the flight crew. As noted, the latest forecast for the ML1 rollback to the VAB is mid-summer. The midway point of the summer would be in August. We'll see if that watch item occurs then. That would then be followed by a few weeks of preparations inside the VAB of the mobile launcher and the High Bay 3 integration cell to begin stacking, starting with the SLS solid rocket boosters. As a whole, the SLS vehicle has been ready to stack since the first quarter of 2024. However, only the SRB hardware has been handed over to EGS. The rest of the SLS pieces still need to be transported to the launch site or officially handed over to EGS, or both. The SRB hardware was delivered to EGS at the end of the summer last year, when launch was still forecast for the end of this year, 2024. After the date was pushed back to September of 2025, EGS completed its offloading and inspections of the booster hardware and buildup of the aft assemblies. The status of that hardware hasn't changed that much in the last quarter. It was already either put in a storage cell or stored in buildup cells. The two aft assemblies are waiting for the call to begin stacking in the buildup cells in the rotation building of the RPSF, which stands for the Rotation, Processing, and Surge Facility. The other 8 motor segments don't require as much pre-stacking work, and they are all stored in the Surge 2 building of the RPSF. The latest forecast was for stacking to begin in the summer, which probably translates to by the end of the summer in mid-September. We'll see, but it would begin with the 2 aft assemblies being transported from the rotation building to VAB High Bay 4, where they would be hooked up to one of the heavy cranes in the VAB and lifted up and over to High Bay 3 and lower down onto the vehicle support posts of Mobile Launcher 1. Once the mobile launcher rolls back to the VAB, that would be one of the next big watch items. All the Orion hardware for Artemis II remains in the Neil Armstrong Operations and Checkout Building in the KSC Industrial Area. The mated Artemis II crew and service modules, also mated to the spacecraft adapter cone, were just returned to the renovated altitude chamber on Friday, June 28th from the final assembly system test, or FAST cell, in the IOZ, the Industrial Operations Zone. prime contractor Lockheed Martin is preparing to begin vacuum testing in the coming days. In April, the mated CSM and SA cone were moved into the altitude chamber for the first time for a series of electromagnetic interference and electromagnetic compatibility tests. Those tests use the chamber, but not its vacuum testing capabilities yet. In the last 2 months since the spacecraft was returned to the fast cell, news about spacecraft assembly and test have been quiet. More attention has been on investigation into the base heat shield behavior seen on Artemis I and whether there are any impacts going forward to Artemis II schedules and plans. Prior to the June 28th move back to the altitude chamber, NASA published a couple of pictures on social media of Artemis II astronaut Christina Koch inside the crew module working on functional testing of the main side hatch. But no other context was included, such as more specifically when this testing was done. We are waiting for the outcome of the independent review of the internal NASA heat shield investigation effort, along with updates on the status of the 2 issues that were disclosed in January and also contributed to the decision to delay Artemis II until the last quarter of 2025. We're also waiting for an update on the resolution and corrective actions for the issue with an electrical circuit in some digital motor controllers and an issue with the spacecraft batteries. So we'll be watching for updates on those issues and any potential impacts, and at the same time watching to see the status of final assembly of the spacecraft. When it returns to the altitude chamber for vacuum testing, how long that testing is expected to take, and when the forecast is for Lockheed Martin finishing final assembly and handing over the spacecraft to EGS are all watch items. I've gone over the SLS boosters, but overall the rest of the launch vehicle is waiting for transportation to the launch site and handover to EGS. ICPS-2 is said to still be waiting in storage in United Launch Alliance's Delta Operations Center at Cape Canaveral. It can't be stacked until after the core stage is mated to the boosters, which was last said to be sometime in the fall. If that's another way of saying by the end of the fall, then somewhere around that time, ICPS would be moved to the multi-payload processing facility to have its attitude control system hydrazine tanks loaded for flight. After waiting in storage at the Michoud Assembly Facility for pretty much the whole first half of 2024, NASA now plans to ship Core Stage 2 to Kennedy Space Center in mid-July, and final delivery preparations are nearing completion. Weather permitting, the stage will reach the launch site by the end of July, where it would nominally have a few weeks of stacking preps to complete. If that's all the work necessary before it's ready to mate to the boosters, then the stage will still have a few months of waiting in the transfer aisle of the VAB. The remaining SLS hardware for Artemis II is at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. The Launch Vehicle Stage Adapter, or LVSA-2, is ready to be transported by barge to KSC. Like the ICPS, it can't be stacked until the core stage is mated to the boosters. NASA's Pegasus barge also has the Core Stage 2 delivery from New Orleans, and possibly also another delivery from New Orleans to Florida that was delayed based on the rescheduling of Artemis II and III announced in January. NASA was protecting the option to perform a tanking test campaign on the SLS only before Artemis II, as a way of continuing work in parallel with the several months of Orion launch processing work that needs to happen before it's ready to stack on SLS. In order to support that, both the core stage and the LVSA need to be transported to the KSC area. In a short update from NASA published on June 25th, the Artemis II Orion stage adapter was said to be in final outfitting before it is ready for transportation. The OSA will be flown to KSC on the agency's Super Guppy aircraft, but it won't be needed until just before Orion is ready to stack on SLS, since the OSA is the connector between them. We've been looking at the big picture for Artemis II a lot, given its somewhat higher visibility. At the halfway point of 2024, the big picture is still slow to clear up. Orion assembly and test are progressing with the spacecraft in place now for the vacuum test, so maybe a handover to EGS is in play by the end of the summer. But we haven't heard anything from NASA. We're still waiting to hear about the review of the heat shield investigation, the root cause, or the corrective actions, which might apply to not just Artemis II, but also Artemis III, IV, and beyond. The core stage for Artemis II could be at Kennedy Space Center in a month's time, but it's not clear when the SLS boosters will be ready to mate with it in the VAB. The mobile launcher schedule at the pad moved from this time at the end of the spring, beginning of the summer, to midsummer, so we'll be watching to see if that holds. If final Orion closeouts can proceed, then maybe we'll start to see stacking by this time next quarter, and maybe an assembled SLS stack, minus Orion, by the end of this year. There's still the whole second half of 2024 to watch. Things quickly get more cloudy after Artemis II. The current status of the Artemis III elements is hard to judge, given the minimal updates in the second quarter of this year. The most visible signs of progress were with the most visible signs of activity, SpaceX development of Starship. What marks progress for the programs varies. For Orion and SLS, we have a better view about the steps they need to make, the path to launch readiness, but we only have a sentence or two of news for the quarter. Without the ability to narrow down where they are, it's hard to narrow down when that hardware will be ready. For Axiom and SpaceX with Starship, we don't know how many steps they need to make. So even though progress is self-evident, we don't know how much ground they would have to cover in the next 2 years. And there are multiple pivotal test flights that need to occur in the next 2 years. Artemis II is planned to demonstrate the full crewed capabilities for Orion and also for SLS to launch Orion. Starship has a number of test flights to demonstrate that their crew-rated lunar lander variant can fly from Earth orbit to the Moon and then descend to a controlled landing on the Moon. They will also need to demonstrate the capability to stay on the surface for some period of time before returning to lunar orbit, although it's not clear how much of that will be demonstrated before Artemis III. For Artemis III status, SpaceX flight tested a fourth Starship prototype in the past quarter. After successfully demonstrating insertion at orbital speeds on the third test in March, the focus of subsequent testing narrowed to recovering both stages from launch. IFT-4 flew in early June, and both stages were soft-landed under control, which was another big step towards the design goal of full rapid launch and reuse. SpaceX is now reworking the heat shield for the next prototype before the next flight test, and a schedule for that isn't clear. It also remains unclear when Starship will return to orbital test objectives needed for the Artemis III crewed lunar landing demonstration. The forward schedule for those demonstrations is unknown, from the ship-to-ship propellant transfer demonstration flights to the subsequent critical design review for the Starship HLS variant, to the tanker flights and uncrewed lunar landing demonstration. The September 2026 target date for launching the Artemis III crew on Orion and SLS is only about 2 years away. By this time in 2026, Orion and SLS would need to be getting stacked and going through final preparations to meet that target date, and Starship would need to be launching tankers to refill the Artemis III HLS to go to the Moon and wait. Time is running out to conduct all the Orion, SLS, and Starship flights between now and then, and that's probably one of the reasons for continued talk about alternate missions. For the Axiom EVA suits that the two-person half of the Artemis III crew will use to walk on the surface of the Moon, we saw fit check and compatibility testing with full-scale mock-ups of the Starship cabin and airlock areas in late April. The recent GAO report noted that a human-in-the-loop vacuum test needs to be completed before the critical design review for the suits can be completed. So that's one of the watch items for the rest of this year. For Orion and SLS, the critical path Artemis III hardware remains the spacecraft and the core stage. The balance of the updates for the Artemis III Orion were provided in the late April presentation by NASA leadership to the NASA Advisory Council's Human Exploration and Operations Committee. I covered the new pictures in those presentations in one video, and then the Artemis III updates in another video shortly thereafter. But there were no updates to the overall Artemis III Orion schedule. The last schedule updates were provided in the fiscal year 2025 request materials from NASA, which were published in March, but which may have been composed well ahead of that time. According to that, the spacecraft was supposed to be delivered to EGS by the end of fiscal year 2025. In other words, by the end of September 2025. That's about 6 months later than the previous forecast of spring 2025 that was provided last August. Looking at a couple of updates provided since then, the current status is that the crew module adapter is reported to be ready for integration with the European service module when it arrives in Florida. A couple of months ago, ESM-3 was reported to be shipping from the Airbus Assembly and Test Facility in Bremen, Germany, to KSC in July. We haven't heard anything since late April, and there was a still image and short video provided right after that in early May showing the OMS engine installed, minus the nozzle, and going through a gimbal test. The crew module is in its wire harness and component install phase of integration. It's not clear if the initial power on for the CM has occurred yet, since we don't have an updated forecast. With that limited information and no direct update of the Orion milestone schedule, it's hard to tell how close the crew module and service module schedules are to the September 2025 handover date that was forecast. And there's still the wild card about the base heat shield investigation and what recommendations might be made for changes to the Artemis III heat shield and beyond that. For SLS, all the solid rocket booster hardware is expected to be in storage ready for stacking by the end of this year. The 10 solid rocket motor segments were completed 2 years ago and remain in storage until stacking is much closer to reality. The aft skirts and forward assemblies are expected to be complete by the end of the year. Likewise, for the ICPS and the connecting adapters, those are either already ready and in storage or will be this year. ICPS 3 was said to be in storage back in the Delta Horizontal Integration Facility, or HIF, at Cape Canaveral. Work at Marshall Space Flight Center to finish outfitting the LVSA and OSA for the mission was expected by the end of this year, and then they will be stored for transportation later. That leaves core stage production of the third unit as the unknown schedule element. I provided an overview of core stage production in a couple of previous videos, but engine section integration and final assembly move or are being moved to the Kennedy Space Center with this third build that supports Artemis III. No substantive updates about progress have been provided since last October, and I went over that in the status update video published at the end of the first quarter. We got a glimpse of the two elements that are probably the farthest along in a picture posted by the U.S. Coast Guard in mid-June. It was taken sometime in May, and we can see the inner tank and forward skirt still in the same integration work areas they've been in for a while. As noted, we haven't got a shot of the engine section for a year. The last view of the LH2 tank was from Thanksgiving last year, and the last view of the LOX tank was in early February. 7 months and 5 months ago seems substantially longer than 4 months and 2 months ago did at the end of the last quarter. As of last October, engine section integration and the TPS applications and internal outfitting work on the liquid oxygen tank were said to be the critical paths. There was the one-liner about the status of the VAB High Bay 2 final assembly facility Boeing is building in the briefing to the NASA Advisory Council in late April. That one-liner said that installation of the vertical tooling has started. There's no forecast for when the facility will be ready to support the final mate of the engine section and the rest of the stage, though, both of which still have more work to do. But nothing more specific about the completion date of the stage than 2025, which also probably means by the end of 2025 or 18 months from now. There's not enough information to tell how realistic it is to finish the new facilities and then finish assembly and test of the stage in the next 18 months. And in the last quarter, the news about the cuts to the SLS stages budget for fiscal year 2024 came out, along with news of Boeing downsizing its SLS workforce, including some layoffs. If the Artemis II schedule ends up drifting farther to the right and farther into the last quarter of next year, that would seemingly push back the no earlier than date for Artemis III, which would provide some additional margin for Orion and SLS core stage deliveries. Looking at the big picture for Artemis III from outside, it's hard to tell where things stand. The programs know where all of this is internally, but from the outside today, with Orion, we generally know where they are, and we know the directions to the destination, but we don't know how fast they're going from one point to another. For SLS, we know the directions to the destination, but we don't know even generally where they are right now or how fast they're going. With Starship, we know they're going fast, but we don't really know where they are, and we don't really know the directions. Hopefully, at some point in the second half of the year, we'll get a better idea about where the programs are for Artemis III. Artemis IV adds dependencies for the readiness of additional elements on top of the Artemis III vehicles, including the initial Gateway capability, Mobile Launcher 2, Exploration Upper Stage and SLS Block 1B, and also the Gateway Logistics Spacecraft and Habitation Module. There were notable signs of progress in the last quarter, but the new capabilities in development or production have much farther to go, given the target date for Artemis IV is still 4 years away. For Artemis IV, 3 important vehicles will be launched before the debut of SLS Block 1B, which marks the official beginning of that mission. The initial Gateway elements will launch on a Falcon Heavy into Earth orbit, and then the power and propulsion element will perform a 1-year-long transfer to the near rectilinear halo orbit that Gateway is planned to stay in. The program provided an update in May, and the recent GAO report added additional details and context. Installation of PPE components is in progress. The propellant tanks were delivered to prime contractor Maxar and were scheduled to be installed already. The solar electric propulsion thrusters are going through qualification testing, and it is hoped they will be ready to install next year. Welding of the halo structure was completed, but structural testing was delayed to make some repairs. Halo is still scheduled to finish that testing in Italy and then ship to Arizona for outfitting by the end of the year. A Dragon XL spacecraft will also launch for the first time ahead of Artemis IV. Authority to proceed, along with funding, was provided last November, but that's the last update we've heard about the Gateway Logistics launch. The IHAB Gateway module will fly on Artemis IV as a co-manifested secondary payload with Orion. The European Space Agency said in the update provided to me in May that welding of the IHAB structure should begin in the fourth quarter of this year, with completion of welding expected in October of next year, 2025. There will still be a significant amount of work left to do after that, though, and the forward schedule for IHAB assembly and test is not public. And another Starship HLS lunar lander will fly out to the Gateway ahead of Artemis IV. There's not much in the way of updates on the Option B lander. It will build on the Option A lander scheduled for Artemis III, so we'll have to see how that goes first. For Mobile Launcher 2, this past quarter saw the big jack and set milestone for the base platform structure on the East Park site pedestals in May, where construction of the ML will be completed. We also saw a shot of the built-up EUS umbilical set up to begin testing in the Launch Equipment Test Facility at Kennedy Space Center. The GAO report released on June 20th notes that the work-to date for handing ML2 over to EGS is November 2026, but we still haven't seen the agency baseline commitment schedule or a master schedule of milestones. There were only a couple of notes of update about the Artemis IV Orion build. ESM-4 is the farthest element along, and Airbus is working towards a goal of delivering that only a year after they deliver ESM-3. We're still waiting for an update on ESM-3 though, but right now the ESM-4 goal would be July 2025. The status provided for the crew module and crew module adapter in the NASA Advisory Council late April update was that they were still in structural assembly, and we saw a couple of pictures of the crew module structure still in the birdcage equipment. No new updates on the schedule or target milestones for the Artemis IV Orion were provided this last quarter. Similarly, no news updates and not much in the way of new pictures were provided for Artemis IV SLS hardware in the last quarter. Another picture from the U.S. Coast Guard tour in May shows what looks like an interstage article being welded in the vertical weld center. It also shows the dome of the EUS LH2 Weld Confidence article before it was installed in the vertical assembly center tool. That at least provides a small update on completing development of the EUS welds. They still need to do those welds and then the analysis of those welds before structural qualification articles can go through all the tooling and be assembled. But aside from that, it's not clear what the EUS or core stage assembly and production schedules are today. The last EUS structural test article forecast from last year was completion in mid-2025, and then shipment to Marshall Space Flight Center for that test series. It's less clear where production of the core stage will fit into the schedule for Artemis IV, and there were no new updates on that in the last quarter. Overall, progress is being made on development and production of all the hardware that needs to be ready for Artemis IV, but it's unclear how to measure that progress right now. NASA has maintained the September 2028 target for the launch of Artemis IV, but that depends on Gateway logistics, and HLS development progress as well. Artemis IV will essentially also be a first launch of the upgraded SLS, and there's still an EUS green run and a lot of verification and validation testing that will need to be done between the first SLS Block 1 vehicle and Mobile Launcher 2 before that can launch with Orion and IHAB. So at the halfway point of 2024, the big picture questions for Artemis IV are about the schedules. If we go in kind of the order of the launches, first, what is the Gateway schedule and how realistic is it? NASA has not provided a new target launch date for the initial Gateway elements, now 6 months after saying the date was basically under review. The baseline commitment date of December 2027 is more conservative, but today it is the only date we know. That date would be too late to support the current Artemis IV planning date. The first Gateway logistics mission doesn't have a date associated with it. At this point, we only know that work has started. For EGS and SLS, how realistic is the Mobile Launcher 2 schedule? We're waiting for the baseline commitment data to see about the current November 2026 work to date that GAO reported recently. And similarly, how realistic is the EUS schedule? For the IHAB module, structural elements have been fabricated, but welding those together hasn't started, so it's too early to tell about that schedule without a lot more data. Thanks for watching. Click on the like button if you found this video informative. There's seemingly the promise of more visible Artemis II activity in the summer. We just saw Orion headed into vacuum test, and we could see the core stage on the move soon. So that'll be something to keep an eye out for.